Time to travel back in time. Number 10. The Denisovan jaw of Xiahe. In 1980, a Tibetan monk exploring Baishiya Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau at an elevation of 3,280 meters above sea level found something extraordinary embedded in the rock. It was a jawbone, massive and ancient, belonging to no animal he recognized. Rather than alerting scientists, he passed it to a local monastery, where it sat quietly in a cabinet, unexamined, for nearly 4 decades. When researchers finally analyzed it in 2019, they realized the monk had been holding one of the most significant fossil discoveries of the century. The Tibetan Plateau is one of the harshest environments on Earth. The air is thin, temperatures are brutal, and modern humans only managed to permanently colonize the region relatively recently, aided by a specific genetic adaptation that allows their bodies to process oxygen more efficiently at altitude. Scientists had long assumed that no archaic human species could have survived up there, that the plateau was simply too punishing for any hominin without modern physiology. The jawbone in that monastery cabinet was about to prove them completely wrong. The jaw is enormous. It is significantly larger and more robust than any modern human or Neanderthal equivalent, with massive molars and a bone density suggesting a powerfully built individual. Researchers Fahu Chen, Jean-Jacques Hublin, and their colleagues published their findings in the journal Nature in 2019, identifying the specimen as Denisovan, a mysterious human relative previously known only from tiny fragments found in a cave in Siberia, nearly 3,000 kilometers away. No DNA could be extracted from the bone, because the conditions of the cave had degraded it beyond recovery. The identification was made instead through ancient proteins locked in the tooth enamel, a technique called paleoproteomics that is rapidly becoming one of paleoanthropology's most powerful tools. Uranium series dating of the carbonate crust on the jawbone placed it at approximately 160,000 years old. That is a staggering figure. It means that Denisovans were living at extreme altitude more than 100,000 years before any modern human is known to have set foot on the Tibetan Plateau. The genetic adaptation that allows Tibetan people to survive at altitude today, a variant of a gene called EPS1, has already been shown to have been inherited from Denisovans. The people who live on the roof of the world today carry a gift from the very species whose jaw was sitting in that monastery cabinet, unrecognized, for nearly 40 years. A species we had barely begun to understand was not only surviving in one of Earth's most inhospitable environments, but thriving there long before we arrived. Since the Xiahe jaw was described, additional Denisovan teeth and skeletal fragments have been identified at the same cave, pushing their presence on the plateau even further back in time. We have no skull, no face, no complete picture of what these people looked like. We have a jaw, some teeth, a few ancient proteins, and the lingering question of what else they were capable of that we have not yet found evidence for. Number 9. The Red Deer Cave People. In 1979, archaeologists excavating Hualongdong Cave, known locally as Red Deer Cave, in Yunnan Province in southwestern China, uncovered a collection of skull fragments that no one at the time could fully explain. The bones were set aside, studied intermittently over the following decades, and finally subjected to rigorous modern analysis by researchers Darren Curnow and Ji Shuiping, whose findings were published in the journal PLOS I in 2012. What those findings revealed sent a quiet tremor through the field of paleoanthropology, because the people who owned those skulls should not have looked the way they did. By the time these individuals were alive, modern Homo sapiens had already spread across much of Asia. The Ice Age was ending. Anatomically modern humans were painting cave walls, carving figurines, and developing the cultural behaviors we associate with our own species. The expectation, when researchers carbon dated the Hualongdong bones and confirmed they were between approximately 14,500 and 11,500 years old, was that they would find the skulls of people who looked essentially like us. That expectation was not met. The skulls from Hualongdong in a second site called Longlin Cave in Guangxi Province, display a deeply unsettling mosaic of features. The faces are flat and broad, with prominent brow ridges. The foreheads are steeply receding. The chins are either absent or weakly developed. The brain cases are rounded, but the overall shape of the skull is thick-boned and archaic in ways that are entirely inconsistent with what modern human skulls from the same period look like. These are not the skulls of people who lived 13,000 years ago. They look like the skulls of people who lived 200,000 years ago. And yet there they are, radiocarbon dated, confirmed, real. Kernow and G considered several explanations. The individuals might represent a very early diverging lineage of modern humans that had retained primitive skeletal features for an unusually long time. They might be the descendants of an archaic population that had survived in isolation in the region while modern humans expanded around them. They might, most provocatively, represent a previously unidentified hominin species that persisted in East Asia until the very end of the Pleistocene. No single explanation has one consensus. The fossils have been compared to Homo erectus, to early modern humans from Africa, and to nothing else at all, because in certain combinations of features, they are genuinely unlike anything in the known fossil record. Scientists named them the Red Deer Cave people because the bones of red deer were found alongside them in the cave, cooked and eaten. They shared their world with modern humans. They were butchering animals, using fire, leaving traces of daily life in ways that are recognizable and human. No consensus has been reached about what they were. The Red Deer Cave. People remain officially unclassified, an open file in the story of our species, a reminder that the edges of the human family tree were not trimmed clean, but ragged and strange and far more crowded than we imagined. Number 8. The Broken Hill Skull. In 1921, miners blasting through a cave system at the Broken Hill Zinc and lead mine in what is now Kabwe, Zambia, broke into a chamber and found a skull staring out at them from the rock. It was ancient, immense, and in extraordinary condition, one of the most complete fossil hominin skulls ever found up to that point. A miner named Zwigelar retrieved it and passed it to the mine's management, from where it made its way to the Natural History Museum in London, where paleontologist Arthur Smith Woodward examined it and formally described it as a new species he called Homo rhodesiensis. For decades, it was considered a straightforward, if impressive, piece of the human evolutionary puzzle. Then a new dating technique was applied to it, and everything changed. Homo rhodesiensis, now more commonly assigned to a group called Homo heidelbergensis, was assumed to be very old. Early estimates placed the skull at anywhere from 300,000 to 500,000 years old, which would comfortably position it as a distant ancestor of modern humans rather than a contemporary. Ancient enough not to cause conceptual problems. Ancient enough to fit neatly into the story, where archaic humans came first, then gave way to Homo sapiens as our species expanded and modernized. That neat story depended on the skull being genuinely ancient. The new dating results suggested it was not ancient enough. In 2020, a research team led by Rainer Grun published uranium series dating results for the Broken Hill skull in the journal Nature. The New Age estimate was approximately 299,000 years, give or take 25,000 years. That is a striking number. The earliest anatomically modern human fossils from Africa, specimens from sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, have been dated to approximately 300,000 years ago. What the Broken Hill skull's New Age implies is genuinely unsettling. This archaic human, with its massive brow ridges, its low sloping forehead, its brutally primitive-looking face, was not a distant ancestor of modern humans. It was, in all probability, a neighbor. The skull's brain case volume is approximately 1,300 cubic centimeters, well within the modern human range, yet everything about its external morphology screams antiquity. The brow ridge is among the most pronounced of any hominin skull ever found, a thick shelf of bone overhanging the eye sockets like a rocky overhang. The back of the skull is shaped very differently from ours. And now we know that a person with a skull like this was alive in Africa at the same moment that the first anatomically modern humans were beginning to emerge on the same continent. They were not separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. They were separated, perhaps, by a day's walk. What happened when these two kinds of human encountered each other is a question the fossil record cannot fully answer. We know that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans because their DNA lives in us today. Whether modern humans and the Broken Hill people ever met, traded, fought, or interbred remains unknown. What happened when they eventually came face to face across whatever landscape they shared, and did any trace of that encounter survive in us? Number 7. The Flores Hobbit. On a volcanic island in the Indonesian archipelago, in a cave called Liang Bua on the island of Flores, a joint Australian-Indonesian research team led by Peter Brown and Mike Morwood made a discovery in 2003 that the scientific world was not prepared for. They uncovered the nearly complete skeleton of an adult female hominin who had died somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 years ago. She was an adult. Her bones were fully mature, and she stood approximately 1.06 meters tall, roughly 3.5 feet, with a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. They called her Homo floresiensis. The press called her something simpler. They called her the Hobbit. The initial assumption when a small-bodied fossil is found on an island is island dwarfism, a well-documented evolutionary phenomenon where large animals gradually shrink over generations when food resources are limited. The island of Flores had, for millions of years, hosted a dwarf version of a stegodon, an elephant-like creature, through exactly this process. It was reasonable to assume that a small hominin found there had undergone the same reduction. The more complicated question was, which hominin had started large and shrunk? And the skull, when examined in detail, provided an answer that satisfied almost no one. The brain volume of the Flores specimen is approximately 380 to 420 cubic centimeters, comparable to the earliest hominins in our lineage, species that predated stone tool use by hundreds of thousands of years. Yet the site at Liang Bua contains stone tools, carefully made, deliberately shaped stone tools, associated with evidence of fire, and with the butchered bones of those dwarf stegodon-like creatures. Someone with a brain that small was organizing hunts, processing carcasses, and maintaining fires in that cave. The combination does not fit any existing model of what that brain size is supposed to be capable of. Brown and Morwood's team formally described Homo floresiensis in the journal Nature in 2004. The scientific debate that followed was fierce. Some researchers argued the skeleton belonged to a modern human with microcephaly, a pathological condition that reduces brain size. This theory was largely put to rest when additional individuals were found at the same site, at least 9 by 2016, all showing the same distinctive features. A pathological individual is possible. A population of them is not. The revised dating published in 2016 placed the species' last known appearance at around 50,000 years ago, coinciding broadly with the arrival of modern humans in the region. Whatever Homo floresiensis was, it persisted on that island for a very long time, maintaining a culture sophisticated enough to hunt large prey and make specialized tools with cognitive machinery that no existing theory adequately explains. The cave it called home for tens of thousands of years contains, in its layers of sediment, the traces of a life that should have been impossible. A brain a third the size of ours organized hunts, controlled fire, and shaped stone on a remote Indonesian island. That is not what the brain size was supposed to allow. Something about what we think we know about intelligence and what it requires is being quietly challenged every time someone looks at that tiny skull. Number 6. The Dali skull. In 1978, a farmer working near a riverbank in Dali County in Shanxi Province, China, noticed something eroding from the sediment that looked unlike any ordinary stone. He reported it, and it made its way to researchers, including paleoanthropologist Wu Xinji, who recognized immediately that what had been found was a nearly complete fossil hominin skull of considerable antiquity. Published analyses by Wu Xinji and American researcher Frank Poirier placed it at approximately 200,000 to 260,000 years old. It was a significant find. What has made it a deeply puzzling one is what the skull's face looks like, and what that face implies about where modern human anatomy actually came from. At the time, Dali was dated. The prevailing model of human evolution held that modern Homo sapiens emerged in Africa and spread outward, replacing or largely replacing archaic human populations everywhere else. In this model, the archaic humans of East Asia, descendants of an earlier wave of migration, were an evolutionary dead end. They were not part of the lineage that produced modern humans. They contributed little or nothing to the people who live in Asia today. The Dali skull looks directly at that model and raises uncomfortable questions. The brain case of the Dali skull holds approximately 1,120 cubic centimeters of volume within the lower range of modern humans. The overall shape of the skull is archaic, with a low vault, thick bones, and pronounced brow ridges, consistent with what researchers expect from a population of this age. But the face is different. The mid-face is flat. The cheekbones are high and angled in ways that bear a strong resemblance to modern East Asian populations. And in 2017, researchers Sheila Athreya and Wu Xinji published an analysis in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology suggesting that the Dali skull shares derived, meaning evolutionarily advanced, facial features with early modern human specimens from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, specimens that are also approximately 300,000 years old and are now considered among the earliest known Homo sapiens. These two populations were separated by the entire breadth of the African continent and the whole of the Asian landmass. If they genuinely share advanced facial features that did not exist in earlier populations, the implication is either that modern human facial anatomy evolved independently in multiple places simultaneously, which stretches evolutionary logic considerably, or that there was gene flow, actual movement and interbreeding of populations across vast distances, 300,000 years ago, in a world without roads, boats, or written language. Neither explanation is simple. Both have profound consequences for the story we tell about our origins. The Dali skull does not fit Homo erectus. It does not fit Homo sapiens. It sits in the space between, wearing features from two different times and two different continents on a single face, a face that was looking out at a landscape in China 250,000 years ago. The standard model of human evolution describes a single road leading out of Africa to the rest of the world. The Dali skull suggests the map may have had far more roads than we have charted, running in directions we have not yet begun to follow. Number 5. Homo naledi. In 2013, a South African recreational caver named Stephen Tucker squeezed through a passage in the Rising Star Cave system in the Cradle of Humankind, northwest of Johannesburg, that measured just 18 centimeters at its narrowest point. On the other side, he dropped into a chamber that no human had entered before. The floor was covered in bones. Hominin bones, hundreds of them, arranged and scattered across the chamber floor in what appeared to be impossible quantities. He photographed what he saw and brought the images to paleoanthropologist Lee Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand, and what followed became one of the most extraordinary fossil discoveries in the history of the discipline. Berger assembled a team of small-framed researchers, specifically because only someone of a particular build could reach the chamber through that 18-centimeter choke point, and over a series of excavations beginning in late 2013, they recovered more than 1,550 fossil elements representing a new species, which they formally named Homo naledi, in a paper published in the journal eLife in 2015. The assemblage is the largest hominin fossil collection ever recovered from Africa. And when researchers first examined the anatomy, they assumed, because the species appeared so primitive, that these bones were ancient, perhaps 2 million years old. They were not 2 million years old. Dating results published in 2017 by Paul Dirks and colleagues placed the naledi chamber specimens at between 236,000 and 335,000 years old. That is not a rounding error. That is a species with a brain volume of approximately 465 to 560 cubic centimeters, roughly a third the size of ours, with a skull shape unlike any known contemporary, living in southern Africa at the same time as early Homo sapiens. A small-brained, small-bodied human relative that looked primitive enough to belong in the Pliocene was walking the same landscape as the ancestors of every person alive today. The morphology of Homo naledi is a contradiction in bone. The hands show a precision grip structure consistent with tool use and possibly tool making. The feet are nearly fully modern in their structure, suggesting a walking gait very similar to our own. The skull, by contrast, is deeply archaic, with a small elongated brain case, unlike any other known species. But the detail that has generated the most discussion is not anatomical. It is behavioral. The remote location of the naledi chamber, reachable only through that near impassable passage and a 12-meter vertical drop, with no evidence of carnivore activity or natural accumulation of bones, has led Berger and his colleagues to propose that Homo naledi was deliberately placing its dead in that chamber, a mortuary practice, a repeated, deliberate behavior for which there is no other satisfying explanation. In 2023, Berger's team announced evidence suggesting that Homo naledi may also have been making deliberate marks on the walls of the cave system, and that there may be evidence of controlled fire use within the chambers. These claims have been contested by other researchers and have not yet achieved broad consensus. But even without them, the picture is deeply unsettling in the most scientifically productive sense. A species with a brain a third the size of ours appears to have been carrying its dead into the deepest, darkest parts of a cave system, in an act that implies not just behavior, but perhaps something we might recognize as feeling. What that means about the relationship between brain size and inner life, between skull volume and the capacity for grief, is a question that the bones of Homo naledi force us to ask without offering any comfortable answer. Number 4. The Iwo Eleru skull. In 1965, a team excavating a rock shelter called Iwo Eleru in what is now Ondo State in southwestern Nigeria uncovered a partial skull buried beneath layers of sediment that spoke to a long human occupation of the site. The bones were cataloged, studied in preliminary fashion, and filed into the slow-moving machinery of academic analysis. Decades passed, when Katerina Harvati and colleagues finally subjected the skull to rigorous morphometric analysis and published their results in the journal PLOS One in 2011, what they found sitting in that archive had been waiting patiently to cause a great deal of scientific discomfort. The Iwo Eleru skull is approximately 13,000 years old. That date was confirmed by direct accelerator mass spectrometry radiocarbon dating, and it is not in dispute. 13,000 years ago is not ancient in paleoanthropological terms. Anatomically modern humans had been present in Africa for at least 280,000 years before this individual was alive. Agriculture was beginning to emerge in the Fertile Crescent. The people making cave art in Europe at this time looked essentially like us. And in West Africa, in that rock shelter in Nigeria, a person with this skull was eating, sleeping, and existing alongside a world that had long since moved on to fully modern human anatomy. The morphology of the Iwo Eleru skull is archaic to a degree that should be impossible given its age. The shape of the brain case is long and low, a profile associated with humans from 200,000 years ago or more, not with the rounded globular skulls of people who were contemporaries with the final Pleistocene. Harvati's analysis compared the skull to a large sample of ancient and modern human specimens from across Africa, and found that it consistently clustered with far older individuals, morphologically speaking. It did not look like its contemporaries. It looked like their distant ancestors. Something had preserved an ancient skull shape in a living population deep into an era when that shape had no business still existing. The most likely explanation, and the one that the fossil evidence combined with genetic data increasingly supports, is that a population of archaic humans, morphologically distinct from modern Homo sapiens, was persisting in West Africa long after modern humans had expanded across the continent and the world. Genomic studies published between 2017 and 2020 by researchers including Pontus Skoglund and Aron Dervasula have found statistical evidence in the DNA of living West African populations for admixture with an unknown archaic lineage, a so-called ghost population that has no identified fossil representative. No bones from this ghost population have been formally described. No face has been found for them. Only their genetic shadow remains, stretched across the genomes of millions of people alive today. The Iwo Eleru skull may be the closest thing we have to a face for that ghost. A 13,000-year-old skull with ancient anatomy, buried in a West African rock shelter, surrounded by the remains of a world that had already moved on, carries the suggestion of a lineage that hung on long after it should have faded, and that left something of itself in the people who replaced it. The ghost population has no name, no complete skeleton, no agreed-upon description. But it interbred with the ancestors of living humans, and if the Iwo Eleru skull belongs to it, then the face of that unknown lineage has been sitting in a museum archive for 60 years, waiting for someone to recognize it. Number 3. The Sima de los Huesos faces. Deep inside the Atapuerca cave system in the province of Burgos in northern Spain, there is a vertical shaft 13 meters deep. At the bottom of that shaft, in a chamber called Sima de los Huesos, the pit of the bones, paleontologists led by Juan Luis Arzuaga have spent decades carefully extracting the remains of at least 28 individual hominins from the sediment. More than 6,500 fossil elements have been recovered, making it the richest hominin fossil site for its time period anywhere in the world. The individuals at the bottom of that pit died approximately 430,000 years ago. Their bones have told researchers things about human evolution that were not supposed to be possible to know from a site that old. And the more data that has been extracted from those bones, the more complex and troubling the picture has become. When the Sima de los Huesos individuals were first studied in detail, through the 1990s and into the 2000s, their morphology told a consistent story. The faces, particularly the mid-facial region, the nasal structure, the arrangement of the teeth, looked proto-Neanderthal. These were, researchers concluded, ancestors of the Neanderthals, a population living 430,000 years ago in Europe that was in the early stages of evolving the anatomical traits that would characterize Neanderthals over the following hundreds of thousands of years. It was a satisfying and coherent interpretation. Then, the ancient DNA results arrived, and the coherence collapsed. In 2013, Matthias Meyer and Svante Pabo's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig managed to extract and sequence mitochondrial DNA from a Sima de los Huesos femur, publishing the results in Nature. The mitochondrial DNA did not group with Neanderthals. It grouped with Denisovans, a species known exclusively from a finger bone and a few teeth found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, 6,000 kilometers away. For a population that looked anatomically like early Neanderthals to carry mitochondrial DNA, linking them genetically to a Siberian population, was, to put it plainly, not what anyone had predicted. The nuclear DNA, published by the same team in 2016, told a different story again, placing the Sima individuals firmly as Neanderthal relatives, which matched their morphology. The two genetic systems in the same bones pointed in two different directions. The most widely discussed explanation for this contradiction is that the Sima population's mitochondrial lineage was replaced by interbreeding with a third, as yet unidentified hominin group that was more closely related to the Denisovans, a group that has left no fossil record of its own. This would mean that somewhere in Europe or Western Asia, 430,000 years ago, there was a population of hominins interbreeding with both the ancestors of Neanderthals and a lineage that would eventually produce or was related to, the Denisovans of Siberia. A whole chapter of human prehistory, with living characters and intertwined lineages, remains entirely invisible to us, except for the strange genetic signal it left behind in the bones at the bottom of a Spanish pit. Among the skulls recovered from the Sima is a specimen designated Skull 5, known informally as Miguelon, one of the most complete hominin skulls ever recovered. Its face is powerful and fully formed, a face that watched the same forests and rivers that Neanderthals would later watch, carrying in its bones the record of a genetic history that does not resolve cleanly into any single lineage. The Cima de los Huesos individuals have been studied longer and more intensively than almost any other fossil hominin population in the world. The more data we extract from their bones, the less certain we become about where exactly they fit in the human story, and the more certain we become that the human story had far more chapters than we have yet been able to read. Number 2. The Hualongdong Skull. In a limestone cave at Hualongdong in Dongji County, Anhui Province, eastern China, excavations produced a collection of fossil hominin remains that researchers including John Yang Li and Xiahe Wu described in detail in a landmark paper published in 2021. The fossils are approximately 300,000 years old. There are remains from multiple individuals, but one partial skull in particular, designated HLD6, has commanded the most attention, because it is built from two entirely different human faces, one from deep in our past, and one that should not yet have existed, fused together into a single 300,000-year-old skull that does not fit any known species. The context in which the Hualongdong fossils were found is important. Eastern and Central Asia in the Middle Pleistocene, the period roughly between 780,000 and 130,000 years ago, is a paleoanthropological puzzle. The region produced a long-lasting and widespread hominin population descended from earlier migrants, but the fossil record from this period is fragmentary, inconsistently classified, and growing more complicated with every new find. Researchers expected Hualongdong to add to this picture in a straightforward way, another archaic East Asian hominin, anatomically consistent with what came before. What they found was not straightforward at all. The upper portion of the HLD6 skull is unambiguously archaic. The forehead recedes. The bone is thick. The brow ridge, while not as massive as some specimens, is distinctly primitive. In these features, the skull is consistent with an archaic population of the expected type. The lower portion of the face is different to a degree that stops researchers cold. The mid-face is flat and retracted in ways characteristic of modern Homo sapiens. There is a chin structure, faint but present, a feature generally considered a marker of modern human anatomy. The overall geometry of the lower face resembles modern humans far more closely than it resembles the archaic contemporaries from the same region. This individual had a modern face on an ancient skull, 300,000 years ago, in China. Homo sapiens, by the most widely accepted current evidence, was emerging in Africa at roughly this same time. The earliest specimens that clearly belong to our species come from sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to approximately 300,000 years ago. If modern facial anatomy was also appearing in a population in eastern China at the same moment, the implications are significant and difficult to absorb. It could mean that gene flow between African and Asian populations was occurring at a scale and at a date far earlier than current models accommodate. It could mean that certain modern anatomical features evolved independently in separate populations on opposite sides of the world, driven by similar selective pressures toward the same biological solutions. It could mean that the origins of our species are not a single event in a single place, but a complex continent-spanning process that the existing narrative of human evolution is not yet equipped to fully describe. The Hualongdong skull sits in a growing collection of East Asian fossils that do not fit the established categories. The Dali skull, the Genetian skeleton, the Harbin cranium, each one a piece of a picture that the current framework cannot accommodate without significant revision. Taken together, They suggest not an anomaly, but a pattern, a consistent signal from the fossil record that the origin of modern human anatomy was messier, more distributed, and stranger than the clean out of Africa narrative has always implied. The Hualongdong skull is not an outlier. It is a warning that the map of human evolution we have been working from may need to be redrawn from its foundations. Number 1. Dragon Man, Homo longi. In 1933, during the Japanese occupation of northeastern China, a Chinese laborer working on the construction of a bridge over the Songhua River in Harbin came across something in the sediment that he immediately understood was significant. It was a skull, enormous and ancient, unlike anything he had seen. Japanese soldiers, aware of the value of such discoveries, ordered him to hand it over. He refused. Instead, he wrapped it carefully and lowered it into an abandoned well near his home, and he said nothing about it to anyone for 85 years. When he was dying, in 2018, he finally told his family what was hidden in that well. The skull was recovered, donated to Hebei Geo University, and formally described in the journal The Innovation in 2021 by a team led by Chang Ji and Nishi Jun. What that description revealed may represent the most significant revision to the human family tree in a generation. For decades, the position of Neanderthals in the human family tree was considered settled. They were our closest evolutionary relatives, the species from which we diverged perhaps 500,000 to 800,000 years ago, and with whom the ancestors of modern non-African humans interbred during the great expansions out of Africa. This was the consensus, built from decades of genetic and fossil evidence, and it shaped every assumption about how modern humans came to be. The Harbin skull, now formally assigned to a new species called Homo longi, the dragon man, carries an anatomy that the describing team's phylogenetic analysis placed in a position that overturned that consensus, closer to modern Homo sapiens than Neanderthals are. The skull is extraordinary in almost every physical dimension. It is the largest hominin skull ever found. The brain case holds approximately 1,420 cubic centimeters, exceeding the modern human average of roughly 1,350 cubic centimeters. The eye sockets are enormous, nearly square, unlike anything in the known fossil record. The face is wide and flat, the cheekbones positioned low. The brow ridges are thick and pronounced, and yet the brain case, when viewed from above and behind, has a rounded, almost modern profile that sits in profound visual contradiction with the ancient-looking face it sits above. Uranium series dating of sediment still attached to the skull placed it at a minimum age of 146,000 years, and some researchers believe it may be considerably older. What Homo longi is, precisely, is one of the most actively debated questions in paleoanthropology right now. The team that described it argues the phylogenetic analysis is clear. This species, and the broader population it represents, is our closest relative among all known hominins. Other researchers have challenged this placement, arguing that the analysis depends on which features are weighted and that alternative arrangements of the family tree remain viable. A separate and deeply compelling proposal, advanced by multiple researchers independently, is that the dragon man skull may be the physical face of the Denisovans, a species previously known only from microscopic fragments, ancient DNA extracted from a finger bone in Siberia, and the Xiahe jawbone from Tibet. If this identification is correct, the implications extend beyond the fossil record into living human biology. Denisovan DNA survives today in the genomes of populations across East Asia, and in particularly high concentrations among the indigenous peoples of Australia, New Guinea, and the Pacific Islands. Parts of the dragon man lineage did not disappear. They were absorbed into the ancestors of people alive right now. The dragon man skull spent 85 years at the bottom of a well. The man who hid it lived with his secret through a world war, through decades of political upheaval, through an entire modern lifetime, and he said nothing. Why he hid it, exactly, what he understood about what he was protecting, will never be known. What is known is that when it finally reached the scientists, it arrived carrying information that the field was not entirely prepared to receive. A single skull has placed in question the position of Neanderthals in our family tree, offered the first possible physical form for a species known only from DNA, and suggested that our closest evolutionary relative was not the pale, stocky-browed people of Ice Age Europe, but something larger and stranger and older. Something that looked out from enormous square eye sockets across the river plains of northeastern China, while our own ancestors were still taking their first steps toward the anatomy we now call modern. Every skull in this list asks the same question from a different angle. And that question is this: in a story we thought we knew, about a species we thought we understood, how many other chapters are still buried, still wrapped in cloth, still waiting at the bottom of a well for someone to finally ask what else is down there? If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.